The sun was barely a crack of light on the horizon when Gideon Stokes heard the sound. It wasn't the rooster. It wasn't the wind. It was the soft, deliberate creak of the henhouse door. Trouble. Out here, miles from anything you could call a town, trouble didn't knock. It snuck in while you were sleeping. Gideon's hand found the cold steel of his Colt, a grim comfort in the pre-dawn chill. He moved without a sound, a shadow detaching from the barn, his boots silent on the packed dirt. And there she was. A woman, thin as a willow branch, her back to him. A ragged shawl covered her head, and a wicker basket was clutched in one hand. She was crouched low, her movements quick and desperate. He didn't need to see her face to know her story. Hunger had a look, a smell, a sound. Stop right there. His voice cut through the quiet, low and steady. The woman froze solid. For a heartbeat, he thought she might bolt, disappear back into the gray woods that bordered his land. But she didn't. She straightened up slow, like every joint ached. When she turned, the faint light caught the sharp lines of her face. She was young, younger than he'd thought, but her eyes were ancient. Tired. "I was just taking a few eggs," she said, her voice raspy from cold or disuse. She held the basket out, a pathetic shield. Inside, nestled on a bed of dry grass, were 3 small eggs. 3 eggs. Gideon walked closer, the crunch of his boots the only sound. "You came all the way out to my ranch for 3 eggs?" She nodded once, a sharp, defiant jerk of her chin. "I have a daughter. She hasn't eaten in 2 days. Her gaze didn't waver. There was no plea in it, just a flat statement of fact. It was this, or watch her starve. He'd heard 1,000 lies from men twice her size. He'd seen grifters and cheats try to play on his sympathies. But this felt different. There was a raw, brittle truth in her stillness. He scanned the tree line, his eyes sharp. "Where is she?" "In the woods. I told her to stay hidden." No hesitation. He studied her a moment longer, the set of her jaw, the way her knuckles were white around the basket handle. Then, he let his hand fall away from his gun. "What's your name?" "Adeline Zeller." She just stood there, braced for whatever came next. A bullet, a rope, a ride to the sheriff. She'd clearly made her peace with all of it. But Gideon didn't do what she expected. He motioned with his head toward the small, sturdy house that sat in the shadow of the bluff. "Bring her in. You can both have something warm." Adeline blinked, the first crack in her hardened composure. You're not turning me in?" "No," he said, his voice flat. "But I don't give second chances. You lie to me again about anything, and I'll drag you to the sheriff myself." She looked down at the basket, then back up at him. A silent agreement passed between them. She turned to the woods and called out a single name, her voice carrying a tremor she hadn't let him hear before. "Ida!" A few seconds later, a tiny figure emerged from the brush. A little girl, maybe 6 years old, with her mother's wide, haunted eyes and a dress that was more patches than fabric. She ran to Adeline, burying her face in the folds of her mother's skirt, a small, trembling animal seeking shelter. Something in Gideon's chest pulled tight. He turned away abruptly. "Get inside," he grumbled. "Fire's going." Inside, the warmth of the kitchen was a stark contrast to the biting air outside. The little girl, Ida, sat at the table and devoured a plate of scrambled eggs and biscuits, like she might never see food again. Her eyes never left the plate. Adeline, however, couldn't settle. She stood by the door, watching her daughter, watching Gideon, watching the windows, as if expecting the world to come crashing in at any moment. "You two been on the road long?" Gideon asked, leaning against the counter. Adeline nodded, her gaze fixed on Ida. "Since August. We were in Ohio. My husband, he died in July. Fever. No family?" Her jaw worked for a moment before she spoke. "None that would have us. My brother died in the war." The story was simple, plausible. He'd heard versions of it a dozen times. A widow and her child, left with nothing, drifting west in search of a new start. He studied her. She held herself together with an invisible string, and it looked ready to snap. "You done stealing?" he asked, his voice blunt. Her eyes shot to his, sharp and clear. "Yes." He nodded once. "Then I have a proposition for you." Her eyes narrowed. "A job?" "No." He pushed off the counter and walked to the small mantelpiece over the hearth. He reached behind a dusty tin and pulled something out. When he turned back, he opened his palm. A ring. Simple gold, worn smooth with time. Adeline just stared at it. "I don't understand." "It's simple," Gideon said, his gaze direct and unflinching. "You need a home. Your daughter needs a roof over her head, food in her belly, safety. I have all that." He paused, letting the words sink in. "What I don't have is a wife." The air in the room went still. Etta stopped chewing, a piece of biscuit halfway to her mouth. Adeline's breath hitched. "I am not looking for charity, Mr. Stokes," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "I'm not offering it," he countered. "This is a trade. You marry me, you and the girl stay here. You get a home. I get a wife, a family, someone to fill the silence in this house." He looked over at Ida, who was watching them with wide, curious eyes. "I'll protect her. And I'll protect you. No questions asked about your past." Adeline stared at him, her mind clearly racing. It was a crazy proposal, a desperate one, but she was a desperate woman. She walked to the table and sank into the chair next to her daughter, her movements slow and deliberate. She put a hand on Ida's head, a small protective gesture. Then she looked back at Gideon, her eyes searching his for any hint of deceit. "If I say yes," she said, her voice finding its strength, "I expect you to keep that promise, to protect her. I always keep my promises." Without another word, she reached across the table. He dropped the ring into her palm. She slid it onto her finger. It was loose. She looked up at him, and for the first time, the hunted look in her eyes was replaced by something else, a flicker of hope, or maybe just exhaustion giving way to acceptance. "I'll marry you, Mr. Stokes." Gideon let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. "All right, then. We'll make it official tomorrow." He looked from the woman to her child, and for the first time in a long time, the house didn't feel quite so empty. But as he banked the fire for the night, he caught a glimpse of Adeline's reflection in the dark window pane. She was watching the road, her new ring twisting on her finger. And the look on her face wasn't relief. It was pure, unadulterated fear. And Gideon knew with a sinking certainty that the trouble he'd let in his house was far from over. The preacher came the next afternoon, a wiry man with a wind-burned face and a Bible as battered as his saddlebags. Gideon had sent a ranch hand at dawn with a note and a silver dollar, and the man had ridden hard. By the time the sun was high, Adeline Zeller was Adeline Stokes. The ceremony was short. They stood under the sprawling cottonwood behind the house, the wind tugging at Adeline's borrowed dress. It had belonged to Gideon's late sister, a pale blue calico that hung loose on her thin frame. Etta stood between them, clutching a sprig of wild sage, her face serious. The preacher didn't stay for supper. He tipped his hat, mumbled a blessing, and rode off, leaving the three of them in a strange, heavy silence. Inside, the house felt different, occupied. Etta, full of rabbit stew, fell asleep on the worn settee, the sage still clutched in her small hand. Adeline stood at the window, staring out at the endless prairie, her new ring catching the fading light. "I haven't lived in a house since July," she said softly, more to the glass than to him. "You'll get used to the quiet," Gideon replied from the doorway. She turned slightly. "What happened to your sister, the one who owned this dress?" "Fever," he said, the word coming out clipped and final. "Same as your husband." He kept his voice even. She married a man from Topeka. He died first. She came back here to have the baby. Neither of them made it through the winter. You buried them here? He nodded toward the bluff that rose behind the barn. Up on the rise. There's a marker. The quiet settled between them again. Not awkward, just careful, like two people testing the ice on a frozen lake. You can take the room upstairs, he said finally. Bed's made. I'll sleep down here. I'm not afraid of you, she said, her voice flat. I know that, he said, but it's proper. She finally turned to face him fully. You didn't ask me if I had a husband. The question hung in the air. He walked to the stove and fed a log into the fire, the flames leaping up with a hungry hiss. I figured a woman running with a child stealing eggs to survive probably wasn't leaving a happy home. He looked over his shoulder at her. Doesn't matter to me what you left behind, only what's ahead. Her expression was unreadable. She walked to the table and ran a finger over the worn wood grain. I can cook. I can mend. I'm not afraid of work. I know. I don't like being beholden to anyone. You're not, he said, pulling out a chair and sitting down. You're my wife. This is your home now. She sat across from him, the table a wide wooden battlefield between them. Her hands were folded in her lap, her knuckles white. He could see the tension in her shoulders, the constant humming readiness to run. She was a bird with a broken wing, perched on his windowsill, ready to flee at the first sudden move. He decided to make that move. The room upstairs, he said, his voice low. In the wardrobe. There's a cedar box on the top shelf. It belonged to my sister. Clothes, some books. You can have them. She nodded, her eyes downcast. Thank you. There's a false bottom in the box, he continued, watching her carefully. Don't open it. Her head snapped up, her eyes wide with alarm, a flicker of the same fear he'd seen last night. Why? She whispered. Because some things are better left buried, he said simply. He stood up, the chair scraping against the floorboards. Get some rest, Adeline. Tomorrow, the work begins. He turned and walked out, heading for the barn, needing the cold night air to clear his head. He had given her a warning, a test. He knew what was in that box. He had put it there himself. A revolver, small and easily concealed, and a stack of letters. Letters from his sister, written in a frantic, terrified hand, describing the man she had married, a man who was charming in public and a monster behind closed doors. A man who, according to the last letter, hadn't died of a fever in Topeka at all. He had simply disappeared, right after she'd fled from him. Gideon went to check on the horses, his gut churning. He had a terrible feeling he hadn't just married a desperate widow. He'd married a woman running from a ghost, and sooner or later, ghosts always find their way home. The first few weeks were a delicate dance. Adeline was a phantom in the house, quiet and efficient. She cooked, she cleaned, she mended Gideon's worn shirts with stitches so fine they were nearly invisible. She spoke only when spoken to, and her eyes were always on the horizon, scanning the long, empty road that led to the ranch. Ada, on the other hand, began to bloom. Color returned to her cheeks. She followed Gideon around the barn, asking endless questions about the cows and the chickens, her laughter a sound the old house hadn't heard in years. Gideon watched them both. He watched the way Adeline's hands would tremble when a rider appeared in the far distance, and the way her shoulders would slump in relief when it turned out to be a neighbor or the mail carrier. He saw her at night, after Ida was asleep, standing by the window, a sentinel guarding against a threat only she could see. She never mentioned the cedar box, and he never asked. One afternoon, he came in from the fields, tired and covered in dust, to find the house strangely silent. Ada was napping on the settee. Adeline was nowhere to be seen. A cold knot of dread formed in his stomach. Had she run? He took the stairs 2 at a time, his boots thudding on the wood. The door to the upstairs bedroom was ajar. He pushed it open, and there she was. She was on her knees in front of the open wardrobe, the cedar box on the floor beside her. The false bottom was propped open, and in her hands she held the small revolver. She looked up at him, her face pale, her eyes wide with a terrible, cornered look. She didn't point the gun at him. She just held it, her knuckles white. "You knew," she whispered, her voice shaking. Gideon leaned against the doorframe, crossing his arms. He kept his voice calm, steady. "I knew you were in trouble. I didn't know the details." "My husband, the one who died of a fever," she began, her voice cracking. "Wasn't your husband?" Gideon finished for her. He walked into the room slowly, deliberately, not wanting to spook her. He sat on the edge of the bed. "And he didn't die." Tears welled in her eyes, spilling down her cheeks. "His name is Thorne, Marshal Elias Thorne, my real husband, Ada's father. His name was John Zeller. He was a good man, a farmer. Thorne, he wanted our land. He trumped up charges against John, had him arrested. John died in a prison camp." The story came tumbling out, a torrent of fear and grief she'd held back for months. Thorne had presented himself as a savior, offering to help the grieving widow. But his help came with a price. He was obsessed, possessive. He saw her and Ida as property he had earned. "He's not a lawman," she choked out. "He's a monster who wears a badge." She had run, taking Ida in the middle of the night with nothing but the clothes on their backs. And Thorne had been hunting them ever since. "These letters," she gestured to the box. "Your sister, Sarah. She wrote about a man named Elias, a charming schoolteacher from Topeka." Gideon's face was grim. His name wasn't Elias, and he wasn't a schoolteacher. A dawning horror spread across Adeline's face. "It's him," she breathed. "Thorne, he married your sister." "Yes," Gideon said, his voice like gravel. "He used a different name. But the man she describes in those letters, the cruelty, the temper, I recognized it. He drove her to run, just like you. She came here, hoping he'd never find her. He must have tracked her, but he was too late. The fever took her before he could." The pieces of the puzzle slammed into place, forming a picture more terrifying than either of them could have imagined. This wasn't a coincidence. Thorne wasn't just hunting Adeline. He was circling back to a place he'd been before. "He'll come here," Adeline said, the gun trembling in her hand. "He'll find me. He'll find Ida." "Yes," Gideon said, "he will." He reached out, not for the gun, but for her hand. He gently closed his fingers over hers. "But this time, he won't find a scared woman alone. He'll find us." Adeline looked from the gun to his face, her breath catching in her throat. He wasn't angry. He wasn't shocked. He was ready. Suddenly, from downstairs, they heard a sound. Ada, crying out in her sleep, a small, frightened whimper. The sound broke the spell. Adeline looked toward the door, her protective instincts overriding her fear. Gideon stood up and walked to the window, pulling back the thin curtain. He stared out at the long, empty road, his jaw tight. "He knows about this place," Adeline said, her voice hollow. "Your sister must have told him." "It doesn't matter how he knows," Gideon said, his eyes fixed on the horizon. "All that matters is that we're ready when he gets here." He turned from the window, his expression hard as stone. The quiet rancher was gone. In his place was a man who understood violence, a man who had made his own peace with it long ago. "Give me the gun, Adeline," he said, his voice leaving no room for argument. "We need to prepare for a war." She looked down at the weapon in her hands, then back at him. The choice was clear: trust the man she'd lied to, or face the monster alone. She placed the revolver in his outstretched hand, and as their fingers brushed, a new sound drifted up from the valley. Faint, but unmistakable. The steady, rhythmic beat of a horse's hooves coming closer. Gideon didn't waste a second. "Adeline, take Ada to the root cellar, now." His voice was a low command, sharp and urgent. "Bar the door from the inside. Don't open it for any reason, not even if you hear me call." She didn't argue. She scooped up the still sleepy Ada from the settee and disappeared down the trap door in the kitchen floor. The heavy wooden door slammed shut, followed by the sound of a thick iron bolt sliding into place. Gideon moved through the house with a deadly efficiency. He took the revolver from the cedar box and a heavy rifle from its pegs over the hearth. He checked the loads, his movements practiced and sure. This was not a man preparing for a fight. This was a man returning to one. He went to the front window, peering through the grimy glass. The rider was closer now, a dark silhouette against the setting sun. A lone man on a powerful black horse. He rode with an unnerving confidence, as if he already owned the place. Gideon's hands tightened on his rifle. He wasn't just a farmer. He wasn't just a rancher. He had a past, same as Adeline. A past he'd tried to bury under years of hard work and solitude. A past that was now riding right up to his front door. The rider reined in his horse 100 yards from the house. He just sat there in the middle of the yard, a patient predator. He was tall in the saddle, wearing a long, dark coat and a flat-brimmed hat that shadowed his face. Gideon could feel the man's eyes on the house, searching, probing. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating. The whole world seemed to be holding its breath. Then the man dismounted. He moved with a slow, deliberate grace, his spurs jingling softly. He didn't draw a weapon. He didn't need to. His very presence was a threat. He walked to the porch steps and stopped. "Stokes!" The voice was deep and carried an easy authority. It was the voice of a man used to being obeyed. "I know you're in there, and I know you have something that belongs to me." Gideon remained silent, his rifle steady. The man on the porch chuckled, a cold, empty sound. "I'm not talking about the woman, Stokes, though I'll be taking her too. I'm talking about my property, the Zeller girl, my stepdaughter." He took a step up onto the porch. The floorboards creaked under his weight. "Her name is Ida Zeller, and according to a federal judge in Topeka, I am her legal guardian. I have the papers right here." He patted his coat pocket. "You are harboring a fugitive, Stokes, and you are illegally holding a child against her guardian's will. Now, you can make this easy, or you can make this hard." Gideon's mind raced. Legal papers, a judge. Thorne hadn't just come with guns. He'd come with the law on his side. He had twisted the system to his will, turning Adeline into a criminal and himself into a victim. "Send out the woman and the girl, and I'll forget I ever saw you," Thorne called out, his voice smooth as poison. Gideon knew it was a lie. Thorne would kill him, take Adeline, and corrupt little Ida. This wasn't about guardianship. It was about possession. "You're not taking anyone," Gideon yelled back, his voice rough. Thorne laughed again. "Oh, I think I am. You see, I know all about you, Gideon Stokes. I know about your sister, Sarah, poor fragile thing. She told me so much about her big brother, the war hero, the quiet rancher." He took another step, his hand now resting on the butt of his pistol. "But she didn't know the whole story, did she? She didn't know what you did before the war. She didn't know about the trail drives out of Texas. She didn't know about the crew you used to run with. Men like Silas Kane." Gideon's blood ran cold. Silas Kane. A name he hadn't heard in 15 years. A name from a different life, a life of dust and blood and stolen gold. "Silas was my brother," Thorne said, his voice dropping to a deadly whisper. "My older brother. You and him and the rest of your gang, you hit a bank in Missouri, got away clean. But then something went wrong, didn't it, Gideon? The money disappeared. And so did you. Silas was caught. He hanged a month later. He never said a word about where the gold was." Thorne was at the door now, his face a grim shadow through the window. "I've been looking for that gold for a long time, Stokes. And I've been looking for the man who betrayed my brother. Imagine my surprise when I found you both in the same place. Your sister led me right to you, even from the grave." The truth hit Gideon like a physical blow. This was never about Adeline. It was never about Ida. They were just pawns. The final pieces in a game of revenge that had started a decade and a half ago. Thorne knew. He knew about the gold, and he knew it was buried somewhere on this ranch. "The deal has changed, Stokes," Thorne hissed through the door. "You give me the gold. You give me the woman. And maybe, just maybe, I'll let you live." Gideon looked around the small, simple house he had built with his father. A place of peace. A place he had come to cleanse himself of his past. But the past had found him. It was standing on his porch, wearing a marshal's badge and a dead man's grudge. He raised his rifle, the iron sight cold against his cheek. There would be no deals, no negotiations. He had built this home to keep the world out. Now he would have to turn it into a tomb. The first shot wasn't Gideon's. It was Thorne's. A deafening blast that shattered the front window, sending glass and splintered wood flying into the room. Gideon dove to the side, rolling behind the heavy oak table as another shot punched through the wall where his head had just been. Thorne wasn't trying to talk anymore. He was trying to kill. Gideon scrambled into the kitchen, keeping low. He could hear Thorne on the porch, reloading, his movements calm and methodical. This was a man who knew his business. "You can't hide in there forever, Stokes," Thorne bellowed. "That house is a wooden coffin, and I'm about to nail it shut." Gideon's mind was a whirlwind. He was trapped, outgunned. Thorne had the advantage of position and surprise. But Gideon had one thing Thorne didn't. He knew the land, every dip, every rock, every shadow. He peered through the kitchen doorway. Thorne was moving along the porch, trying to get a clear line of sight. Gideon fired his rifle not at Thorne, but at the heavy lantern hanging from the porch roof. The bullet struck metal. The lantern exploded, showering the porch in burning oil and broken glass. Thorne cursed and jumped back, momentarily blinded. It was the opening Gideon needed. He bolted out the back door, sprinting across the yard toward the barn. The sun had dipped below the horizon now, casting long, deep shadows across the ranch. He slammed the heavy barn doors shut behind him, plunging the vast space into near-total darkness. The air was thick with the smell of hay and animals. He could hear the nervous shifting of the cattle in their pens. He moved silently to the side wall, pressing himself into the shadows. He heard Thorne's footsteps crunching on the gravel outside. He was circling the house, checking the windows, closing the net. Then, silence. Gideon held his breath, straining his ears. Where was he? Had he gone back to the house? Was he trying to get to the cellar? To Adeline and Ida? A new sound, a soft, scraping noise, coming from above. The hayloft. Thorne hadn't gone around, he'd gone over. He must have climbed onto the stable roof and was now crawling into the hayloft window. A classic flanking maneuver. Gideon smiled grimly in the darkness. Thorne was smart. But Gideon was smarter. He knew something about that hayloft that Thorne didn't. Years ago, his father had replaced some of the floorboards, but he'd used green wood. Over time, the wood had dried and warped, creating a weak spot right in the center of the loft. It looked solid, but it wouldn't hold the weight of a full-grown man. Gideon moved to the center of the barn, directly under the weak spot. He took one of the cowbells from a peg on the wall. He gave it a single, sharp ring. The sound echoed through the silent barn. A clear invitation. Here I am. He heard a muffled curse from the loft above, followed by the sound of movement. Thorne was taking the bait. Gideon flattened himself against the central support beam, his rifle raised, his eyes fixed on the ceiling above. The floorboards creaked. Once, twice. Then a loud crack, a splintering of wood, and a shout of surprise. Thorne came crashing through the ceiling in a shower of dust and hay, his long coat flapping around him like broken wings. He landed hard on the dirt floor, his pistol flying from his grasp. Gideon was on him in an instant. He didn't shoot. This was too personal for a gun. He slammed the butt of his rifle into Thorne's side, knocking the wind out of him. Thorne grunted in pain, but was surprisingly fast. He rolled, lashing out with his boot, catching Gideon in the knee. Pain shot up Gideon's leg, but he ignored it. He and Thorne scrambled to their feet, circling each other in the gloom, two wolves fighting over territory. "You were always clever, Stokes," Thorne rasped, clutching his side. "But clever won't save you." He lunged, a long, wicked-looking knife appearing in his hand as if from nowhere. Gideon parried the blow with his rifle barrel, the screech of steel on steel echoing in the barn. They grappled, a desperate, violent struggle in the near darkness. Thorne was strong, fueled by years of hatred. But Gideon was fighting for more than revenge. He was fighting for the quiet life he had built, for the woman and child hidden beneath his house. Thorne shoved him back against a stall. The knife flashed again, aiming for his throat. Gideon twisted, the blade slicing through his sleeve and scoring a deep line of fire along his arm. He grunted, using the momentum to bring his rifle up, smashing it into Thorne's jaw. The marshal stumbled back, spitting a mouthful of blood, but he didn't fall. He just smiled, a bloody, terrifying grin. "Is that all you've got?" he snarled. From outside, a new sound cut through the night, a high, terrified scream. Ida. Thorne's grin widened. "Sounds like my little girl wants her papa." In that split second of distraction, Thorne lunged again. Gideon wasn't ready. The knife plunged deep into his shoulder. A searing, white-hot pain exploded in his chest. His rifle clattered to the floor. Thorne stood over him, victorious, the bloody knife in his hand. "It's over, Stokes," he said, his voice dripping with triumph. "The gold is mine. The woman is mine. Everything you have is mine." He raised the knife for the final blow. But as he did, the barn doors creaked open. A figure stood silhouetted against the moonlight, small, determined. It was Adeline, and in her hands she held Gideon's heavy, double-barreled shotgun. "Get away from him," she said, her voice shaking, but clear and cold as a winter morning. Thorne turned, a look of shocked disbelief on his face. "Adeline, my dear, put that thing down before you hurt yourself." "I said, get away from him." He took a step toward her, his smile condescending. "You wouldn't dare. You don't have the nerve." He was wrong. Gideon had seen the fire in her eyes when she was protecting her daughter. And he saw it now. The desperate courage of a mother pushed to the absolute limit. Thorne took another step. "Give me the gun, Adeline." A flash of memory hit Gideon. The cedar box. The false bottom. He hadn't just put one gun in there, he'd put two. The small revolver and his father's old sawed-off shotgun. An easy gun for a woman to handle. A gun he'd left there just in case a day like this ever came. Adeline's knuckles were white on the stock. Her aim was steady. "I won't tell you again," she said. Thorne laughed and lunged for her. The blast from the shotgun was apocalyptic in the enclosed space. It threw Thorne backward off his feet, a ragged, dark hole appearing in the center of his chest. He hit the wall of a stall and slid down to the dirt, his eyes wide with a final, ultimate surprise. Silence descended on the barn, broken only by the ringing in their ears and the frantic, terrified lowing of the cattle. Adeline stood frozen for a moment, the shotgun still pointed at the space where Thorne had been. Then the weapon slipped from her trembling fingers and clattered to the floor. She rushed to Gideon's side, her face a mask of terror and relief. "Gideon, are you all right?" He clutched his shoulder, the pain a dull, throbbing roar. Blood was soaking his shirt. "I've been better," he rasped, managing a weak smile. "But I'll live." He looked at the body of Elias Thorne, a dark heap in the shadows. The ghost that had haunted both their lives was finally gone. "You saved me," he whispered, his voice thick with awe. Adeline shook her head, tears streaming down her face. "No, we saved each other." She helped him to his feet, his arm slung over her shoulder. They staggered out of the barn and into the cool night air. The moon was high now, bathing the ranch in a pale, silvery light. The trap door to the root cellar was open. Little Ida stood at the top of the ladder, her face tear-stained, her eyes wide. When she saw them, she let out a cry and ran, throwing her small arms around both their legs. The three of them stood there for a long moment, a broken, battered, but finally whole family, clinging to each other under the vast, starry sky. The war was over. But Gideon knew the biggest challenge was yet to come. Because buried somewhere on this land was a fortune in stolen gold, a secret that had already cost 3 lives. And now it was theirs. They buried Thorn on the far side of the bluff in an unmarked grave. There was no preacher, no prayer, just the rhythmic scrape of Gideon's shovel against the rocky soil, a final grim punctuation mark on a violent chapter of their lives. Gideon worked with one arm, his other shoulder tightly bandaged, the pain a constant nagging reminder of how close they had come to losing everything. In the days that followed, a new kind of quiet settled over the ranch. It wasn't the lonely silence of before, nor the tense, fearful silence of waiting for Thorn. It was a quiet of healing, of recovery. Adeline tended to Gideon's wound with a gentle, practiced hand. Ada, sensing the shift, stayed close, often just sitting in the same room, her quiet presence a comfort. They were a unit now, forged in secrets and sealed in blood. One evening, about a week after the fight, they sat at the kitchen table. The lamp cast a warm glow on their faces. Ada was asleep upstairs. "The gold," Adeline said, her voice low. It wasn't a question. Gideon nodded, staring into the flame of the lamp. "It's here. I buried it the night I got back from Missouri. I never touched it. I never wanted to. It was blood money." "What do we do with it?" He looked up at her, at this woman who had walked into his life with nothing and had ended up saving it. This woman he had married out of convenience, who was slowly becoming the very center of his world. "That life is over," he said, his voice firm. "The man who stole that gold died a long time ago. I'm not him anymore." He reached across the table and took her hand. Her fingers curled around his, a perfect fit. "It's not my gold, Adeline. It's ours. We decide what to do with it, together." A tear traced a path through the dust on her cheek. "All I ever wanted was a home, a safe place for Ida." "Then that's what we'll use it for," he said. "We'll buy more land, better cattle. We'll fix the fences, build a new wing on the house. We'll give Ida the life she deserves, a life without running." The next morning, Gideon took a shovel and walked out to the old, withered oak tree that stood alone in the west pasture. The one his father had always said was lightning-struck and useless. He dug. An hour later, he hit the rotting wood of a small chest. He pried it open. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth, were stacks of money and canvas bags heavy with gold coins. A fortune, enough to change their lives forever. He didn't feel a thrill of excitement. He didn't feel greed. All he felt was the weight of it, the weight of the past. He carried the chest back to the house and set it on the kitchen table. Adeline and Ada stood beside him, their eyes wide. "This is our new beginning," Gideon said. And it was. They didn't leave the ranch. They rebuilt it. They poured the blood money back into the land, cleansing it with hard work and honest sweat. They bought a new bull, a flock of sheep, and 2 strong horses. Gideon hired a couple of ranch hands, good men he could trust. The small house grew. A new bedroom for Ada, with a window that looked out over the fields. A bigger kitchen for Adeline, filled with the smell of baking bread. A wide porch where the 3 of them would sit in the evenings, watching the sun set over their kingdom. The fear slowly faded from Adeline's eyes, replaced by a deep, quiet strength. The haunted look left Ida's face, her laughter now loud and frequent. And the emptiness that had lived inside Gideon for so long was filled. Years passed. The gold was spent, absorbed into the soil, into the wood of the house, into the life they built. It became just another story, a dark fairy tale they never spoke of. Ada grew into a young woman, with her mother's fierce eyes and Gideon's steady hands. She learned to ride and rope, but also to read and write, Adeline teaching her from the books in the cedar box. One cool autumn evening, as the first chill of winter touched the air, Gideon and Adeline sat on the porch, watching Ada chase fireflies in the twilight. They were older now, their hair streaked with gray, their faces lined with the maps of their lives. Gideon's shoulder still ached when a storm rolled in, a permanent souvenir from Marshall Thorne. Adeline's hands, though no longer trembling, were rough from gardening and housework. They weren't the same two desperate people who had met in the pre-dawn gloom of the henhouse. They had been reforged together into something stronger. Adeline leaned her head on Gideon's shoulder. His arm went around her, a familiar, comforting weight. "You're a good man, Gideon Stokes," she whispered. He smiled, looking out at the land that was his, at the family that was his. "I try to be." He had offered her a home to save her from the world, but in the end, she and her daughter had been the ones to save him from himself. They had filled the silence, chased away the ghosts, and given him a reason to build a future, instead of just hiding from the past. It wasn't a fairy tale ending. It was something better. It was real. A life built on a foundation of lies, but redeemed by love, courage, and the simple, stubborn refusal to be broken. What they built on that quiet piece of land wasn't just a ranch. It was a testament. A testament to the fact that sometimes the most beautiful things can grow from the most scarred and broken ground. If you enjoyed this story of survival and redemption, make sure you hit that subscribe button and don't forget to ring the notification bell so you don't miss what's coming next.